Afternoon and welcome everyone to ELPC Thinks. I'm Howard Lerner. I'm the Executive Director of the Environmental Law and Policy Center. Quick heads up, we are recording this webinar. We're going to put it on Facebook and YouTube so that you can show it to friends and neighbors and others who maybe couldn't join today. And we're honored to have with us David Ullman. David is a highly experienced attorney who led the US EPA's Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance during the Biden administration. And David was at the US Department of Justice for 17 years, where he led criminal environmental enforcement efforts. I first met David at the University of Michigan Law School, where he led the Environmental Law and Policy program. David is smart, accomplished, and brings an amazing sense of decency to the work that he has done, and I'm sure will continue to do. So David and I will have a little conversation today about the Trump era regulatory rollbacks, the changes of enforcement, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A, assuming we have some time. All right? So if you have a question, go to the Q&A icon, put it in there. We'll do our best to try to get to as many as we can. So David, thank you for being here today. And for those folks who don't know, can you just do a quick summary of, from your perspective as enforcement chief, what does the head of enforcement do at US EPA, and how does that interact with the US Department of Justice?
I'm happy to do so. Let me say first, thank you, Howard, for the very gracious introduction. And I feel equally strongly about Howard Lerner, who provides exceptional leadership at the Environmental Law and Policy Center, which I view as the premier environmental group in the Midwest and one of the top environmental groups in the United States. And we're so fortunate, Howard, that you're at the helm of ELPC, and that ELPC is going strong at a time when we, as we'll talk about, need groups like ELPC more than ever.
Well, thank you, David. And we have a great team here. We're stepping up our game. We need to. So talk a little bit about, what does good enforcement look like at the US EPA with the US Department of Justice?
Okay, you added on there. So I'll do both questions. Your law professor roots are showing. So the first question was what does the assistant administrator do at EPA? And the second question is, what does good enforcement look like? So the EPA assistant administrator is responsible for enforcement and compliance assurance activities across the country. So that's everything from inspections to what are referred to as administrative actions, which are entirely within EPA, civil penalty cases and requests for injunctive relief that are sent to the Justice Department, and also criminal investigations that are referred to the Justice Department for criminal charges. There were, as of December 31st, when I left the agency, there were approximately 2,800 people working on enforcement issues across the United States. So it's a very, it's a large program. About, at the time, it was, excuse me, it was about a sixth of the agency's personnel was in the enforcement program. Although that's down a fair bit from where enforcement had been during the Obama years. A lot of budget cuts starting in 2011 have really limited enforcement to a significant degree. But that writ large is the area of responsibility for the head of enforcement at EPA, all administrative, civil, and criminal enforcement activities. In terms of what a good enforcement program should look like, enforcement has to be fair, it should be robust, and it should absolutely be nonpartisan. An enforcement program at EPA, and for that matter, enforcement anywhere in the federal government, should be based on the law and the facts without any regard to politics. So one of the things we're going to want to talk about this afternoon is how enforcement at EPA and across the federal government is being politicized in this administration, which is the violation of one of the first principles of law enforcement and what it means to be a nation of laws. And that's one of the most significant concerns that I have today about what's happening at EPA. One other thing I'll say, though, is that the enforcement program at EPA, in my view, and this was a shift I tried to lead, it should be focused on the most significant public health and environmental challenges facing the United States. So under my leadership, we started the first ever climate enforcement strategy at EPA. We added a climate initiative, a PFAS initiative, a coal ash initiative to the existing initiatives that we had inherited from the prior administration. And we did that because, those are, it was my view that EPA shouldn't be playing small ball. We have to be working on, at EPA, we have to be working on the most significant, I call them 21st century environmental challenges, doing it in a way that's transparent, doing it in a way that promotes fairness, provides a level playing field so that law-abiding companies are not at a competitive disadvantage with polluters, and most of all, does everything possible to protect communities across America from harmful pollution.
So David, you mentioned nonpartisan. I know this, but let's just point out and recognize that while you were the assistant administrator at EPA for enforcement during the Biden administration, if I recall, you were at the Department of Justice for 17 years doing criminal environmental enforcement, which means you were served in both Democratic and Republican administrations. And I know you well enough to know that you did your job very well, regardless of whether it was a Republican or a Democratic administration. So what's your take on what's happening now at EPA? Drastic rollbacks of staff, programs, reorganizing the agency. What does this all mean as a practical matter when it comes to enforcement?
How much time do we have?
Well, go for it, David. And
yeah.
I want to get to the Q&A, but this isn't the law school lecture. This is David summing it up and telling people what's going on.
Yeah. So let me. There's a lot we can talk about here, and I'm happy to, hear what people think and try and put those thoughts in context. So I will be brief, but first of all, let's start with the EPA administrator. He has announced that EPA is powering the Great American Comeback, and there are 5 pillars to his leadership of EPA. 3 of them are restoring American energy dominance, making the United States the artificial intelligence capital of the world, and bringing back American auto jobs. So just pause for a moment and think about those, and ask yourself, what do those have to do with the mission of the Environmental Protection Agency? I challenge anyone to find any reference in any of the environmental laws to restoring American energy dominance, making the United States the artificial intelligence capital of the world, and bringing back American auto jobs. Laudable goals, to be sure, but just not the work of EPA. So, first and foremost, part of the problem we have is an administration that's completely abandoning the critical historical public health and environmental mission of the agency. The other major problem we have, and this is before we even get to enforcement, is that this administration is leading an assault on the federal government that is making all of us less safe and is cutting essential services across the government. So whether we're talking about Social Security checks, whether we're talking about Medicare and Medicaid, whether we're talking about at EPA, the ability of inspectors to make sure the drinking water systems are safe, this administration is attacking all of that and weakening our country's ability to do all of that essential work. And so, look, administrations come and go, policies change, but we've never seen this kind of assault on the federal government, on the federal workforce. It makes, the pretty challenging Reagan era look like child's play. And we should all be concerned about that. And what that means is not only have we shifted the mission of the agency, but we're really contracting its ability to do its essential work. And that's before we get to the rollbacks and before we get to what they've done in the enforcement space, which is bring everything to a screeching halt. I mean, they literally, in the first week of the administration, called for an enforcement pause. An enforcement pause meaning they weren't going to move forward on any pending enforcement matters. They weren't going to bring any new enforcement matters, and they still haven't brought any significant new civil cases at the Justice Department. They have brought some administrative cases, but they paused everything. And I just want, to put it in context. Imagine an attorney general coming into office, or a new district attorney coming to office and saying, you know what, we're gonna just take a pause here. We're not going to prosecute any new cases. We're not going to bring any new cases. I mean, the outcry from the public would be enormous. I mean, it's the role of government to uphold the rule of law. It's not a transient concept. You don't pause it because you've started a new administration. You might say to the career staff, what are the most significant matters that are pending or that are under consideration? We want to know about those. I did that. I'm sure my predecessors did that. That's responsible leadership and responsible management of the enforcement program. But an enforcement pause, unprecedented. And I'll just add one more
that's
thing.
Sort of like, let's
go ahead.
pause the speed limit on the interstate highway systems while we decide whether we want to promote fast cars or not.
Yeah,
Meantime,
nice metaphor.
Do whatever you want to do.
Do whatever you want to do. Yes. And I mentioned 21st century environmental challenges like climate change. We created a national initiative around that. They've gutted it. I didn't mention, but alluded to promoting environmental justice, which is, if you sum up environmental justice, it's the idea that everybody living in the United States should be able to breathe clean air and drink safe water. They apparently don't want that. I mean, why that is not a goal that every administration embraces is beyond me. In fact, it had been a goal that every administration embraced, dating all the way back to George Herbert Walker Bush, but not this administration. So, we've seen a major shift in how EPA is approaching its mission, and it leaves our country far worse off. We've seen a major attack on the federal workforce, including at EPA, where approximately 3,000 people have left or are leaving. And we've seen a significant downturn in enforcement communities. And what all that means is that the environment is less protected and the public is less safe.
So if you take what I've always viewed as our core environmental values, the rights of people to breathe healthy, clean air, the rights of people to drink safe, clean water, and the rights of people to live in communities without toxic threats. And if you look at the federal statutes, whether it's the Clean Air Act or Clean Water Act or RCRA, Resource Conservation Recovery Act, or the Superfund law, those are federal statutes that are all geared around EPA having responsibilities so that people have healthy, clean air, safe, clean water, and can live in communities without toxic threats. And we've made tremendous progress. For anybody who lives by Lake Michigan, as I do, we remember when the Clean Water Act was enacted a little bit more than 50 years ago. There was brown, foamy stuff all over the water. Absolutely, if you swam in the lake, didn't want to drink the water. You didn't want to swallow it. And alewives and other fishes filled the beaches. We have a ways to go, but the lakefront and the lake and swimming, tremendous asset. Fishable, swimmable, it is, and it's got to get better. But I'm looking at this administration retreating from core environmental values that have been acted through statutes, and that there's tremendous broad support by the public. How do you navigate that, David, with what the statutes say, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, RCRA, Superfund law, and what the agency is doing?
Well, first of all, I love your reference to Lake Michigan. I spent my summers
That's right. You're on the other side of the lake.
On the other side of the lake. And my dad used to say, this was the 1970s, he used to say, on a clear day, you can see Chicago. And I'll be darned, I tried really hard as a kid. I could never see Chicago. And I came back as a law professor at the University of Michigan, probably 15 or 20 years ago. And it was a beautiful day. And I looked across the lake and there was Chicago. Clear as day, you could see Chicago. That's a Clean Air Act success story. That's all about reducing air pollution from the refineries and factories that line the southern part of Lake Michigan. So in many ways, the health of the Great Lakes, including Lake Michigan, is a bellwether for both the environmental progress we have made and the environmental challenges that we still face. But you asked about our environmental statutes and how they apply across administrations in effect. And you know, this shouldn't be a secret. I don't think this is a secret, but it merits emphasis. The environmental laws don't change depending on whether there's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House, whether progressives or conservatives hold the balance of power in Washington, D.C. The environmental laws require EPA working with the states to protect the environment, to promote clean air, to promote healthy rivers and streams, as you put it, to make sure that we're living in communities free of toxic waste. And those basic obligations apply, those laws apply regardless of who the president is. And one of the things we need to get away from in this country, there's a lot that needs to happen in this country, but one of the things we need to do is get away from this idea that the environment is somehow a partisan issue. And that support both for environmental protection and in the area where I served at EPA, the need for fair and robust environmental enforcement is something that comes and goes depending upon who the president is. The environment doesn't care about our political parties. It doesn't care about our political views. What we're seeing, you know, the challenges we see on the Great Lakes and the greater challenges we see with climate change, with PFAS contamination, with a whole host of environmental problems, none of that should be partisan. We need to get the partisanship out of protecting the environment. We need to get back to a time where we came together about environmental issues, and that's certainly what the environmental laws that you asked about expect of us, and we should live up to those expectations.
You know, Mark Lundholm has a comment more so in the Q&A box. And he's talking about, do some people view environmentalists as a pejorative? But I'm thinking about the values for clean water and clean air and so forth. At the Environmental Law and Policy Center, every 2 years, we hire respected pollsters and market researchers to do focus groups and polling addressed around clean water in the Great Lakes. And what we basically find is when it comes to protecting the Great Lakes, it's where we live, work, and play. And it's an 85% issue. And it's almost as if, you know, when you push people and you say, you know, how much should we do to protect the Great Lakes and restore them? It's like, whatever it costs, you do it. And when it comes to safe, clean drinking water, again, it's an 80% issue. We were told by the market researchers, you don't need to do this anymore. And we're not doing it in Chicago or Ann Arbor, Michigan. This is in Grand Rapids. It's in suburban Detroit areas, suburban Milwaukee areas, Green Bay, Wisconsin, Toledo, Ohio, places where you have a lot of Republicans, independents, and Democrats and swing voters and so forth. We're not just doing Madison, Wisconsin or Ann Arbor, Michigan. And we've essentially been told when it comes to safe, clean water, doesn't matter gender, doesn't matter race, doesn't matter age, doesn't matter city versus suburbs versus rural, you know, complete public consensus on that. And you're right, David, the politics is now just at such odds with where the public is. So talk, if you would, a little bit about EPA Region 5. For those of you who don't know, EPA Region 5, headquarters in Chicago, it covers the states of Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and it also houses within it something called GLENPO, the Great Lakes National Program Office, which covers the Great Lakes, and that, of course, picks up Pennsylvania and New York with Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And it does a lot with Canada as well, because 2 provinces, 8 states around the Great Lakes, 42 million people get their drinking water supply from the Great Lakes. It's an enormous largesse. It's a global gem. But when it comes to enforcement, EPA Region 5 is sort of different than other regions. Why don't you explain and talk about that a little bit? Because the people listening here predominantly are in EPA Region 5.
Yeah, EPA Region 5 is a special place to be. And of course, the Great Lakes are a national and international jewel and deserving of protection. But I don't think the Midwest and EPA Region 5 is unique in terms of what you talked about a few moments ago, Howard, about people caring about environmental protection. I think the question is an interesting question. The term environmentalist is pejorative, much like the word liberal is pejorative, much like the word conservative for some people is pejorative. But being an environmentalist, I think that's pejorative to the extent it's pejorative because we've gotten so polarized and so tribal, and for whatever reason, Republicans who have a rich history of protecting the environment, dating all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, the Environmental Protection Agency was created when Richard Nixon, a Republican, was president. Most of the environmental laws were signed under Republican presidents, and there was a great tradition of Republican support for environmental protection and conservation. But for whatever reason, over the last few decades, the conservatives in this country, Republicans in this country, have moved away from that support. And so we do get this cleaving, we do get the pejorative concept that the question spoke to. I hope we can move past that, because I think you're right. In the Great Lakes region, but I think actually in communities all across America, people care about clean air. They care about healthy rivers and streams. They don't want to live in communities where there's significant pollution. It's a core central value that all Americans share. So in that sense, I don't think Region 5 is different, but Region 5 is a special place within EPA. It's from the enforcement program, it is the largest part of the enforcement program, at least the largest of the 10 EPA regions, based in Chicago, covering the states you mentioned. Year in and year out, there's more enforcement cases brought in Region 5, and some of the biggest cases are brought in Region 5, not because Region 5 is more polluted than the rest of the United States, but EPA has committed more resources to the area. The population density is significant. The amount of industry is significant. The size of the regulated community is significant. And I want to be clear, most companies in America care about meeting their obligations under the environmental laws. And today, especially, we need the private sector. We need the private sector to meet or exceed its obligations on the environmental law. We need the private sector to care about environmental stewardship and about sustainability. But one of the things I learned at the Justice Department is there's always going to be some people who break the law, whether it's out of ignorance, whether it's out of arrogance, whether it's out of not wanting to make the resource commitment to meeting their legal obligations. There's always going to be a fair amount of non-compliance. And that's why we need a fair and robust enforcement program at EPA and at the Justice Department to hold polluters accountable and make sure that environmental progress occurs in every state across the United States and in every community across the United States.
You know, David, let's talk about the role of citizen suits when the federal government either doesn't do enforcement or some group thinks that the federal government isn't doing enough. During the last Trump administration, ArcelorMittal, which is now owned by Cleveland Cliffs, emitted excessive amounts of ammonia and cyanide into Lake Michigan from its steel mill in Burns Harbor, Indiana. And to sort of add insult to injury, didn't tell people right away what had happened. 3,000 dead fish turn up floating on the little river going into Lake Michigan. The Indiana Dunes National Park closed its beaches on a wonderful August weekend. The city of Portage shut down its water supply, and ArcelorMittal Cleveland Cliffs then said, oops, we'll tell you what happened. And for whatever combination of reasons, the federal government under the Trump administration, that EPA, didn't step up and act in an enforcement way. The Environmental Law and Policy Center, also representing the Hoosier Environmental Council, filed a citizen suit in federal court in Northwest Indiana. And we wound up with a very extensive consent decree that the federal government also entered into under the Biden administration. Cleveland Cliffs had to clean up and fix some of its processes at the steel mill, paid substantial fines or penalties, did more monitoring, and did a variety of things, including donating a piece of land that's now going to become part of the Indiana Dunes National Park. We hope in the future. 127 acres is transferred to the Shirley Hines Land Trust. I tell that as a story of how citizen suits can make a real difference. But in the best of worlds, the federal government will be doing everything 110% terrific on environmental enforcement. In the real world, even if you're doing 100%, the fact of the matter is there's still some things that aren't being done where citizen suits are important. Under the current situation, where it's, as you're describing, shall we say, well less than 100%. Talk about what the role is of citizen suits, how can they fill the gap, and how much can they fill the gap? Because even though I'm a big believer in citizen suits, you know, the Environmental Law and Policy Center and our good colleagues at Earth Justice, NRDC, Environmental Defense Fund, and others, you know, we don't have the resources to do what the federal government should be doing with its responsibilities. So talk about how this fits together.
So let me start by saying that the citizen suit provisions of the environmental laws are one of the uniquely American features of our environmental law system, and actually something that we exported to the rest of the world in a positive way. We're not seen as at the cutting edge of environmental protection in the United States today. I think the United States has fallen behind Europe for sure in terms of climate action, in terms of ensuring that the public is protected from harmful chemicals. I mean, there are a lot of ways. After, you know, we had a great moment in the 70s and 80s when we instituted a lot of environmental protections in the United States, and then we just stopped. And so the rest of the world, actually, or at least the rest of the more developed parts of the world is ahead of us in terms of basic environmental protection. But we did do a lot of pretty amazing things in that 1970s and 1980s period that influenced the rest of the world. And one of the things that we did was add this citizen suit provision to the environmental laws. And it's so powerful. It's often referred to as a private attorney general model because it gives ordinary citizens, when the federal government fails to act and when the state governments fail to act, it gives ordinary citizens the ability to stand in the shoes of the government and bring the cases that the government's not bringing. What an innovative concept and what a powerful concept for protecting the environment. We don't have that in a lot of other areas of the law. So it's a really unique feature of our environmental law system. It's a really good feature. I probably shouldn't talk about it too much, or maybe this Congress is going to go after it. But it's a great feature of our system, and it's one that other countries around the world have emulated, although no one to quite the degree that we do. It also includes the ability for groups like ELPC to challenge the government, either when the government doesn't regulate but should, or when the government regulates but in ways that are not sufficiently protective of the environment. So in addition to the sort of private attorney general stepping into the shoes of the government provision, there is the ability to force the government to act when the government's not acting. That's actually Massachusetts versus EPA.
Exactly.
It's forced the government to act in the climate space, the Bush administration, when they were refusing to do so. And, you know, in the last Trump administration, there were hundreds of environmental rollbacks, and nearly all of them, not all of them, but nearly all of them were stopped by the environmental community suing under these citizen supervision. So I can't say enough about how valuable it is that we have such a robust citizen suit model in the United States, certainly for times like this when the federal government has abandoned us. when the administration has abandoned communities across America that need environmental protection and depend on the federal government for environmental protection. And we can talk about this a little bit more, but I do want to emphasize, because I'm trying not to be too partisan, that I think that citizen supervision is tremendously important, even when there's a more energized EPA. I was at ELPC while I was assistant administrator. I visited the offices and spoke to a large number of people, many of whom were involved in doing citizen suit work, and wanted to know, well, what can we do? And I had to kind of be careful about what I could say. I couldn't be directing what citizen suit.
Yeah, you have to say, David, that you're doing your job and you're doing it very well. And thank you, David, for your service.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Howard. Privilege and an honor to serve at EPA in the role that I had. But we weren't getting to everything. And I can say now, and I think we kind of arrived at this that afternoon in Chicago, even without my saying it explicitly, there were whole areas we didn't get to. Like we didn't get to non-point source pollution very much. We didn't get to the problems that big agriculture, corporate farming causes in America. And, one of the single largest areas of unaddressed pollution is the pollution coming from factory farms. And it's a huge problem in the Great Lakes region. It's something ELPC is taking on. And I'm so grateful that ELPC and others in the environmental community in the Midwest were taking on non-point source pollution, the runoff from agriculture, because it was very difficult for EPA to do it. The EPA is a political football as it is. And if we had waded in a big way on big ag, it would have been an enormous challenge. And so you guys picked that up, and thank goodness for the citizen supervision, because you were doing something that frankly we weren't. We were doing a little bit of it, but we were not doing it nearly as much as we needed to. Yeah. So really important whether you've got a protective administration or one that doesn't.
What's interesting on the case you're referring to, David, the Lake Erie citizen suit enforcement case, Environmental Law and Policy Center is now joined as co-plaintiffs, the city of Toledo and Lucas County, which is the Ohio county that surrounds Toledo and abuts Lake Erie. So it's fascinating now, the local public officials, the city of Toledo, the county, the environmental groups, all joining together saying enough is enough. The Ohio EPA acknowledges more than 90% of the phosphorus that's getting into Western Lake Erie that causes toxic algae bloom outbreaks every summer. More than 90% is from the agricultural sector, and that's excessive fertilizer and it's manure that's running off from the factory farms that you're referring to, running off or otherwise getting into the water system. Gets into the Maumee River Basin, Maumee River empties into Lake Erie. You can't clean up Lake Erie unless you reduce the amount of phosphorus from the factory farms and all that manure, because if you have thousands of cows and hogs and chickens, they produce a predictable amount of manure. And if that manure gets into the water system, it causes Lake Erie to become toxic algae outbreaks. And we got to get that stopped. We got to get that fixed. That's reductions that have to be achieved. All right, David, look forward for us. Where's their hope? What is it that we can and should be doing that you think will make a difference, not just in the next 3.5 years of the current administration, but as we have a longer view, the arc of history, what's the difference we can make here? How do we best use our resources?
So, I want to acknowledge that hope is in short supply these days. I think there's a lot of despair and a lot of concern about.
You're a public interest lawyer. You have to have hope.
Yeah,
you don't have hope, then what are we doing? And
well, I'm going to
go
to hope.
You got to. So I acknowledge your point. There's a lot of despair. How do we find that hope?
Yeah, but I think I think we start by acknowledging how concerned people are right now, and how upset people are right now. How watching people people from other countries who are living in the United States being seized on our streets, how upsetting that is to people, how un-American that is, or at least how much that betrays our values as a country.
Right.
I think when we see the kind of assault I talked about earlier on the federal government and its ability to provide essential services to communities across America, people are upset and concerned. And look, when we see the kind of false and misleading comments by our president and by people in his administration, and when we see the kind of authoritarian behavior that we're seeing, people are concerned for good reasons. So I do want to acknowledge that, but to your point, I think we all need to acknowledge that, recognize it for what it is, and then say, okay, what can we do about it?
Right.
I mean, when I was asked by the EPA administrator why I wanted to serve in the Biden administration, which was I met with him in April of 2021, so it was on Zoom because it was still COVID. I said this moment for the environment, this moment for EPA. And I was thinking about just everything that had happened in the first Trump administration and the need to rebound from that. I think this moment is even more important than that one was. I think that it is, if we're going to prevent authoritarianism from gaining a foothold in this country, everybody who cares about democracy needs to speak up, speak out, and be prepared to take action. If we care about the environment and protecting communities across America from harmful pollution, all of us need to speak up, speak out, and take action. And so what does that mean for a group like ELPC? That means that we need groups like ELPC, and it's not just ELPC. It's groups across the nonprofit world who do the essential work of bringing citizen suits. We need them to do everything they can to step up and fill this enormous breach that's been created by the retreat of the federal government. But I want to be clear, we need more than just ELPC and its partners among the green groups. Like, we need state and local governments to do their jobs, to be at the front lines alongside ELPC and the NGO world in continuing to insist that we hold polluters accountable and that we meet the goals of the environmental laws in communities across the United States. And if I may just add one more thing, I alluded to this earlier, but we need the private sector. I mean, I spoke a couple of weeks ago in Minnesota at a State Bar Environmental Institute, mostly lawyers who represent private industry. And I said to them, look, this is a moment where your clients may want to pull back on environmental compliance. Federal government's not going to come after them. And frankly, the federal government does far more of the work than state and local governments do historically. So, for those who want to evade the requirements of the law, they may see this as an opportunity. And I think people in the environmental law bar, lawyers representing those companies, and I think people in those companies need to say no to that. They need not to take advantage of this moment and put us at even greater risk. They need to step up and say, you know what, the private sector has a responsibility here too. They need to be good stewards of the environment too. They need to be good corporate citizens, and they need to meet or exceed their obligations under the environmental laws, even though the federal government's probably not going to be holding them responsible.
David, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for everything you've done, and I know you will continue to do. ELPC is stepping up. We're meeting the moment. For those of you, by the way, who will be in Chicago on June 6th, please join us for the ELPC Gala. It's on the rooftop of Navy Pier. We'll be looking over Lake Michigan. It's always a good time, and there'll be a link in the follow-up to this webinar. Our marketing team appreciates me saying this, but more fundamentally, David, we're all in this together, and everybody who's joined today, let's work hard to protect our core environmental values. David's right. We need to recognize the reality, but not give up, take action, and do things that make a real difference for people, our planet, and our communities. Thank you for joining us today. Take care.
Thank you, Howard. Good to see everybody.